Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll just give it a few seconds for people to hop in before we get started. All right. So hello again. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Forestry Adaptation Practitioner Network's webinar on using climate data and models in forest management. My name is Brooke Desema, and I'm one of the facilitators of this online practitioners network, which is run by us here at the Climate Risk Institute. And I'm here today with my colleague, Claire Sanders, who will be in the back end to provide support. And if at any time during the webinar you have any questions or experience technical difficulties, click on the chat box and you can find our names in the drop-down menu of the participants and send us a direct message. And if you can't see our names, you can also send a message to hosts and panelists. And just to let you know, we are recording this webinar today, and we'll be sending out a copy of the recording along with the slides to all those who have registered for the webinar. So keep an eye out for that. Before we go any further, I would like to gratefully acknowledge that I'm currently located on the traditional and ceded territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And Indigenous people have long modeled sustainable forest management and land stewardship practices. And at the Climate Risk Institute, we are continually trying to improve both our knowledge, processes, and relationships so that we can highlight and integrate Indigenous perspectives and knowledge of climate change into our work. And I invite all of you to introduce yourselves and share the territories you're joining us from today in the chat if you would like. So this webinar is part of the Forestry Adaptation Practitioner Network, formerly known as the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or the FACOP. This practitioner network is made possible with support from the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, Climate Change Task Force, and we've recently developed our online platform, which many of you may already be a part of, but we're going to take a few minutes to give you a quick tour of that platform. And for that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Claire, who will just give you a brief overview of the new space, highlight some of the new features, and that we think you'll find useful. So off to go. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you so much, Brooke. You can see my screen, the right screen.
Yep.
Awesome. If you could actually just put the link into the chat for me, that would be great. I'm really pleased to give you a very brief overview of our new practitioner space. So for those of you already in the group, we're glad you're here, and Brooke is putting that invitation in the chat for those of you that would like to join now as well. Once you click on that link, you'll be asked to register. If you belong to the old community of practice, your registration was not transferred over, so you would need to make a new account here. And once you register and go through, you will land on this site. So this is the new platform, and this is really intended to be an interactive online community dedicated to advancing knowledge and action in the area of forestry, climate change impacts, vulnerability and risk assessments, and adaptation. It can serve as a location where researchers, experts, policymakers, and practitioners can all come together, ask questions, generate ideas, share knowledge, and communicate with others working in the field. Membership to the network is free, and you can create an account by following that link in the chat. And we were able to launch this network and relaunch this network thanks to the vision and generosity of the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers Climate Change Task Force. So this is a private group, and it means without that link, you'll need to be approved to join, but it is free. So there's no, we certainly don't restrict access. This is not the only hub on the platform. It's called earthnet.ca. It's a large environmental networking platform, and once you have a login, you're welcome to explore the rest of the site. Currently, there's several other hubs dedicated to bringing people together across Canada to solve some big challenges around things like home energy retrofits and those kinds of pieces. So we thought it was a really great location for the Forestry Adaptation Practitioners Network. Once you enter the space, you'll see there's a number of posts in here already. The intention, of course, is that all members can come here and begin to populate the space. I encourage you to have a look through the existing posts, and you'll see there's a variety of things that you can do in here. I encourage you to interact with the posts as well. You can star posts, you can comment on posts, And if you want to quickly get to, some resources, all you need to do is click on this menu here, updates, events, resources, and it'll show you upcoming events and that kind of thing. Any resources, NRCan tools, whatnot. And then some of the updates include things that we're finding in the news or academic articles. It's got a really excellent search function. So if you are looking for something like data, all you have to do is click data, and anything to do with climate data will come up. You can see NRCan tools, questions people may have asked about climate data, where they get their climate data from, that kind of thing. So feel free to search for posts. If you can't find what you want, you can come in and make your own post. So you can, up here, you can, there's a variety of things you can do: add a story, add an action, post an update, add a resource, add a job. We don't, because this is a very specific area of practice, we don't have a lot of jobs posted, but certainly it's an area where if you're looking for a specialist in climate services or something, you could certainly post a job in here, and it's very easy to do. So I'm not going to go any further. I'm going to perhaps take some questions that we get today in the Q&A, and I'm going to transfer them here. And that's amazing because then they're here forever, right? We don't lose them at the end of the webinar, and you can continue to connect with other practitioners on the subject matters that we're talking about today. You can also see who else is in the group. This is really beneficial as well. You can just go to the People tab, and you can scroll down and see your fellow practitioners as well across Canada, which is really great. You can go over on the filter button, and you can actually see where in Canada they are from. By clicking on Canada, you can see where your fellow practitioners are across Canada. So I think I'm going to leave it there. Don't hesitate to let us know either throughout the webinar today, or send us a message about the Practitioners Network, or if you have any trouble joining. And just a final note, when you join it, you will receive a weekly email from Brooke, weekly, bi-weekly email sometimes from Brooke, with any updates that are made in the network. So it means you don't have to come back every day to check if there's anything new. You'll receive an email at the end of the week with all of the forestry adaptation resources in Canada for that week. And then we encourage you, if it piques your interest, to click on a link and then come over to the space, comment on it, or star it or something like that. And we hope you find it useful. So stay tuned, please join us, and we look forward to seeing you in the practitioner space. Back to you, Brooke.
Thank you very much, Claire. Yeah, that was a good demonstration. So yeah, a few housekeeping items. We'll have some time at the end for a dedicated Q&A session, but that doesn't mean you have to hold your questions until then. You can always feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box or the comment box below, and then we'll direct them to our speaker at the end when he wraps up. Yeah, so with that being said, we are very excited to have our speakers here today, and I would just like to briefly introduce them. We have today with us David, who holds a forest operations degree from the University of British Columbia. He's a registered professional forester and registered professional engineer. He's a multi-generational forestry worker from Vancouver Island, and he has worked throughout coastal BC and Western Canada in a variety of roles. At Mosaic, he leads several initiatives on carbon, climate, and hydrology, and is passionate about climate and watershed resilience to support a healthy industry for the next generation. We also have Molly with us here today. Molly has spent her multi-decade career in the forest sector, working throughout coastal British Columbia as a tree planter, timber cruiser, research technician, and biologist. And before joining Mosaic 10 years ago, she is Mosaic's leader in forest management certification, environmental performance, community relations, and fish and wildlife management, including the Species at Risk program. Molly holds a biology degree from the University of British Columbia and a diploma of technology in forest ecosystems from the BC Institute of Technology. She's also a registered professional forester and a registered professional biologist, and she's passionate about forestry's role in the climate-smart future and about creating a diverse and equitable forestry sector. Last but not least, we have Ben. Ben is a PhD candidate in the Climate Laboratory in the Geography Department of the University of Victoria. His research, teaching, and fieldwork experiences have all centered around investigating important relationships between both weather and climate on crucial resources of fresh water in Western and Northern Canada. And he has recently been involved in a multi-year research internship with Mosaic Forest Management and the MITEX program. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you, David, Molly, and Ben, and thank you again for taking the time to present this webinar for us today. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to you to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Brooke. Good morning, everyone. If you're on the west side of the country, good afternoon. If you're not, as Brooke said, I'm Molly and happy to be here today. I'd like to start by respectfully acknowledging that Mosaic operates in the territory of the Coast Salish, the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Nuu-chah-nulth, and the Haida-speaking peoples, and I'm coming to you today from the territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. On behalf of our team here today, I'd like to also thank the organizers for inviting us to speak and for the invitation to join this impressive group of forest professionals across the country. So today we're going to talk about Mosaic's approach to climate change planning thus far and how we're using climate data and climate models in our forest management. Next slide, please, Ben. More specifically, I'll start with an intro to the company for those who aren't familiar, some context and background on our climate change work so far. I'll provide a high-level overview to our climate solution strategy approach, and then hand it off to Ben, who's going to cover some details of our regional climate modeling work. And then finally, David will bring us home with a focus on some of the exciting mitigation projects that we've developed. Next slide, please, Ben. So for Mosaic, for anyone unfamiliar with us, we are a West Coast timberlands company, management company with the vast majority of our production coming from a private forested land base. We also manage various public licenses in this region, and we've been in operation here in BC under various names for over 100 years. We're a privately owned company. Our two investors are Canadian pension funds. And finally, our forest management and supply chain is certified under the Sustainable Forestry Initiative for forest management, PEFC for chain of custody, and ISO 14001 for environmental management systems. Next slide, please, Ben. Now, just to set a little bit of context around why a privately owned timberlands company that operates on privately owned lands would be investing in climate change planning. I don't have to tell this group there's a clear global imperative to do this work. It's been articulated in the Paris Agreement, UN COP sessions, biodiversity conferences, all calling for concerted action on climate. All of the IPCC reports that we've seen have clearly indicated that nature-based solutions are a priority, and that's where forestry fits in. Canada and BC have various plans and targets to support a net zero goal of 2050. And finally, in the marketplace, our primary forest management certification, SFI, now requires the explicit treatment of climate change aspects in its standard with the new Climate Smart Forestry objective. And Mosaic was successfully certified to this new objective in early 2022. Next slide, please, Ben. So when we saw that SFI was bringing in these specific requirements around climate change planning, that was really a catalyst for us to work on formalizing what we call the climate solution strategy at the company. And we completed that last year. We worked on this through a cross-functional team, mostly internal folks, but also some external experts. And we used established methodologies like the one shown here, adapted from the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers Guidebook. And so in this process, we review current and potential future context and develop a vulnerability assessment for the organization. This assessment helps us identify and prioritize adaptation and mitigation strategies at the local scale, particularly for Mosaic's managed forest lands. And it also identifies actions and key deliverables, which really sets the stage for us to continue to progress towards a climate smart future. And Mosaic has committed itself to a net zero goal for 2035. Next slide, please. Now, a few examples of what we've already been doing. This strategy development was a great opportunity for us to coalesce all of the efforts that we've already been making over many years on climate adaptation, like tree genetics improvements at our seed orchard in Saanich, our Mount Newton seed orchard, and things like bigger culvert designs. And so on the mitigation space first, our greenhouse gas accounting, our carbon storage projects really make us leaders in this space. David is going to talk more about that near the end of the presentation. On adaptation, this work is ongoing and has been part of our practices for some time. A few examples here, but Ben is going to touch on our weather station network, which supports the modeling work that he undertook. Next slide, please, Ben. Some of the things that we've been working on recently and that really came out of the climate strategy work that we've been undergoing. We've incorporated climate change planning explicitly into our enterprise risk management framework in our company. So that means that this risk is elevated to the level of our executive team, to our board of directors, and to our ownership, to just elevating the importance within our organization. In the last year in particular, I'll highlight that we've been really focused on engagement. And so we've started with internal engagement. That's bringing in all of our professional staff and sharing our modeling work, sharing the action planning that we have on our plate now. And now we're expanding that engagement into our contractor community. So the thousands of folks that work for us out in the woods, on the water, at our facilities, they're going to be a key collaborator for us on emissions reduction work. And it's important that they come with us along this path. So now we're going to take a deeper dive into the regional climate modeling work that we identified as a priority project when we were putting our strategy together, and we completed it with Ben's excellent help. We've been working with Ben and with the University of Victoria for a few years now, and the expertise and knowledge that Ben brings to this space was essential for us to be successful here. So with that, I'll pass it over to Ben. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Molly. Just to continue on, the regional climate modeling work was accomplished by the Mosaic Climate Solutions team as part of a broader initiative to investigate how different climate parameters are expected to change across different areas of Vancouver Island, and importantly, across different time periods into the future. This work was intended to form a foundation for collaborating with different operational branches on identifying activities and processes of each branch that are likely to be impacted. It's also crucial to note that different areas of Mosaic operations will require substantially different mitigation and adaptation strategies, given that climates across Mosaic operational land bases can vary significantly, even across very small spatial scales. And that's something that we'll get into later in this presentation. So we began this modeling work with a couple foundational goals in mind. The first of which was to support the overarching goal of assessing current and future forest operations vulnerabilities using the best resources available for coastal British Columbia in particular. We wanted to inform decision-making with respect to mitigation and adaptation opportunities, and accomplish this ultimately by providing robust climate projections for Mosaic operational regions, because this was critical for improving their ability to estimate, mitigate, and adapt to the cumulative effects of forestry practices and climate change across coastal alpine watersheds that are under Mosaic management. This work was to assist in identifying crucial gaps in our operational understanding, as well as inform adaptation and mitigation strategy options for different operations with respect to impacts like peak flows, water supply, and other natural hazards. It was also expected that financial costs can be reduced while simultaneously improving the protection of people, the environment, and infrastructure in the process. We wanted to use readily available climate tools and data with the hope of producing custom climate projections, figures, and reports for 4 key operational zones of Mosaic. And a big focus in the production of these projections, reports, and data was operationalizing this data in spatial formats, as well as in a format that would be relevant to different shutdown parameters that we have operationally. And those are more centered towards wet weather shutdown conditions with respect to landslides, as well as obviously fire weather conditions in the drier summer months. Again, a quick breakdown of definitions that I don't expect anybody in this particular seminar is going to need, but just in case. When we're talking about weather, we're talking about the instantaneous conditions of the atmosphere over a specific place, current temperature, humidity, wind, cloud cover. When we're talking about climate, we're talking about a more integrated look at the atmosphere over a far larger time period. And obviously, with respect to climate or scientific normals, we're talking about a 30-year period. When I'm speaking to different forestry personnel, the way I like to explain the difference between the two, climate is all of the different clothes and field gear that you have in your closet. Weather is what you decide to wear out into the field that day. Generally speaking, watersheds in our coastal region of BC are comprised of complex mountainous topography, and they experience considerable seasonality with respect to precipitation, which is an important part of our work on the coast. Interchanging sequences of east-moving low pressure and high pressure systems strongly regulate the weather across coastal BC. These high and low pressure systems can form adjacent to the Aleutian Islands in the North Pacific, and these low pressure systems migrate easterly towards BC, especially during the winter months, bringing frequent inputs of rainfall, mixed rain and snow, as well as snowfall during these winter months due to the moist frontal systems that move from the Pacific across BC and then into the interior of the country. Vancouver Island has a transitional snow zone that is located primarily between 300 and 900 meters above sea level, typically receiving important rain on snow events any time during that November to April winter period. Snowpacks within this area are likely to completely melt and reform several times throughout the cold season, while snowpacks above 900 meters are likely to persist throughout the wintertime. While the winter months receive considerable precipitation, July and August generally receive very little precipitation, sometimes inducing elevated drought and forest fire risks. And as we've mentioned already, Vancouver Island is truly a mosaic of different weather and climate zones. For example, if we just look at the graphs here on the page, we can see 3 different cities: Victoria, Port Renfrew, and Port Hardy, and they're circled in the purple rectangles of the map on the top right. And right away, you can see that there's a 2-degree difference in average summer temperature between the northern Port Hardy and the southern Victoria. And additionally, just note that Port Renfrew, with respect to its precipitation, in the winter months can be well over 3 times that of Victoria, despite only being about 80 kilometers away, and more than double that of Port Hardy. Port Hardy gets about 3,500 millimeters of precipitation a year, so 3,500, while Victoria, not even 100 kilometers away, gets less than 900 at about 882 millimeters. So again, that's about the distance from Hamilton to Markham, and we're seeing a difference in 4 times the annual precipitation. And again, I'll show a graph of Hamilton here just because I happen to grow up there, so I'm always looking to give it a shout out. But it's also important to note that when our precipitation falls is crucial on Vancouver Island. We get most of it during those winter months, very little in the summer, obviously. In more continental areas, it's far more evenly spread out. Weather is obviously fundamental to mosaic operations on Vancouver Island. As a result of the stark differences in weather and climates over very small differences, Mosaic has invested in and maintains a network of well over 40 weather stations across Vancouver Island to inform operations in different areas, as well as provide valuable data from which we can derive meaningful temporal and spatial analysis of significant weather events. This is just an example of some of the data from a very large atmospheric river event we had in November of 2021, which caused widespread flooding and different destructive effects across BC. Now, a quick geography lesson for everyone here about the reason, for example, that Victoria gets comparatively less rain than Port Renfrew, for example. This is due to important orographical processes that are at play on Vancouver Island. The rain shadow effect suppresses rain over certain parts of Vancouver Island and is caused mainly by the Olympic Mountains of Washington State, and to a lesser extent, the Vancouver Island mountain range, or the insular mountain range that runs down the central spine of Vancouver Island and actually extends as far north as Haida Gwaii. The Olympic Mountains envelop the southernmost portion of Vancouver Island. They reach up to about 2,500 meters above sea level, and they intercept a ton of precipitation that would otherwise be heading for the southeast region of Vancouver Island. The Vancouver Island ranges, which bisect the island from north to south, further enhance this west to east rain shadow. And these factors combine to suppress rain in the southeast portion of Vancouver Island and create the conditions for Canada's only Mediterranean climatic zone. And again, we'll get into why this is important for certain Mosaic operations later in this talk. With respect to the vulnerability of different forestry operations to climate change, I think the two main factors that we began our analysis of was just changes obviously to average conditions and changes to extreme conditions. Changes to average conditions are just obviously the typical weather conditions for a given place. Again, are those climate normals, those 30-year standards of data that we like to infer, are those going to be changing moving forward, as well as changes to extreme events, which are obviously rare occurrences of unusually severe weather at a given place. They're obviously quite different from average conditions or climate normals, since they represent the most unusual conditions recorded for a given location. Measurements of extremes, especially with respect to long-term records, continue to be used in forming the basis of the design of major infrastructure, such as bridges and dams, crucial components of operations with Mosaic. But they're tricky because they're so, they're important, they're destructive, but they are also very hard to study because they happen so infrequently. And I think contextualizing what changes to average and extreme conditions can mean in the context of Mosaic operations can be best explained by discussing, for example, a recent trip I took out to Mosaic Seed Orchard. That's out in an area of Vancouver Island called Sydney. And I went out there to discuss potential challenges and opportunities that the seed orchard might be facing on a day-to-day basis, as well as on a long-term basis moving forward. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is that most, if not all, of the coastal BC seed orchards in Canada are located on the Saanich Peninsula, about a 20-minute drive from Victoria, because of the warm and comparatively dry climate that I outlined earlier is ideal for inducing cones. Now, at the Mosaic Seed Orchard, we grow about 90% Douglas fir, as well as a little bit of cedar and a little bit of white pine. The team that works there likes it there. They'd ideally like to run that seed orchard indefinitely, but as the climate changes, their current existential question is, will their location continue to be ideal for an orchard 10, 20, 50 years down the road? Now, there's obviously a number of operational, ecological, and genetic adjustments that they can make, and they're already making there, but it takes 20 years for a new seed orchard to become ecologically and financially productive. So if they need to move the orchard further up island, for example, sooner would be better rather than later. They can plant more trees. They could keep them smaller to curb the risk of heat and dryness, but obviously prolonged dry air and low relative humidity could desiccate their crops, and that's an issue that would be challenging to deal with. Another thing to consider is that cones need a requisite amount of cool weather or chilling hours in the spring. If it's too hot, it causes problems. But conversely, there are also benefits to cold. The problematic Douglas fir seed midge is killed by frost. So again, if we're losing too many frost days, could that be an issue? So ultimately, their big question is, will the average climate conditions of that Saanich Peninsula shift in such a way that the seed orchard is actually better suited to be located elsewhere? And as if struggling with these sort of existential questions wasn't enough for the seed orchard team, they came into work in the middle of that November atmospheric river event to find that several acres of the orchard had slipped down the hill in a debris flow, caused by saturated and waterlogged soils. And as of June last year, they were still engineering a drainage solution so that it wouldn't happen again. So just like the average conditions, will extreme conditions change in a way that causes a number of necessary infrastructural and logistical adjustments. And I think the nature of her debate at the Orchard perfectly underscores the types of questions Mosaic is considering and must continue to ask of itself when trying to plan for how future climate realities might impact different operational activities in the future. Another example of the climate-related challenges facing forest operations was brought up during a previous climate projection information session that we undertook with different regional groups of Mosaic personnel. The North Island log sort facility needs water to irrigate the pavement area to reduce dust for ground crews, as well as cool the asphalt, since cooling the asphalt helps reduce asphalt damage from equipment, as well as reduce tire overheating and premature failure. The wells have always had supply issues in the summer, but in recent years, they've been running low as early as the late spring. And as a result, they need to engineer some type of solution to cope with this changing water availability issue, even in the northern area of Vancouver Island, which is not typically associated with any shortages of water. So all of this formed the impetus to begin our project of trying to help us predict how changes in average and extreme conditions are likely to be spatially and temporally distributed across Vancouver Island in the future. We used downscaled output from global climate models, and again, integrated over our own designed polygons of 4 main operational areas of Vancouver Island. And again, it should be stated that projecting future climate is obviously incredibly difficult, and it gets even harder the further into the future you are trying to predict future climates for. Our goal was to package tools for professionals that include the best spatial data for future climate projections with relevant parameters of interest to their particular operations. We used internal processes to decide on which models, emission scenarios, and parameters to consider in our regional model projections. And David will touch on some of those later in this presentation. And again, just to go over a couple quick crucial findings from these early iterations of climate projections that we undertook. This is just a look at how precipitation is likely to change relative to this 1981 to 2010 baseline, moving into 2 different time periods in the future. Notice here that we're looking at the summer, which is June, July, and August, and winter, which is December, January, February. And we can just see what the average trends in precipitation per day in those time periods is going to look like. And again, we can see the importance of what many have liked to refer to as the intensification of the hydrological cycle. We're going to get wetter, rainy periods and drier summer conditions here in coastal BC. So I hope we can all appreciate too that there's different scales between the summer and winter periods, but for both, the more red pixels you see, the wetter it is, and the more purple you see, the drier. And we can just see that we're going to get a greater proportion of wet weather, and especially on that western coast. So again, we can see the pretty clear impacts of rain shadows and orographic topography having important controls on the distribution of precipitation on Vancouver Island. When we look at the maximum 1-day precipitation event that we're likely to experience as well, we can see important changes. So again, we're not just going to experience that intensification from the standpoint of getting wetter wet seasons and drier dry seasons, but we're also going to be expecting larger events in general as well. So that increase in precipitation is also going to come in larger events. And again, this is going to have important implications for slope stability, for things like culvert sizing, flood mitigation, all of those things. And also noticing that in those summer months, for example, we are likely to see an increase in drier conditions. So again, looking at the summer here on the top, we can see those purple pixels denoting very dry conditions starting to spread over a farther amount of Vancouver Island, and especially that already dry southeast portion. Snow is a crucial parameter in watersheds on Vancouver Island. Its extent and the timing of its melt strongly dominates the hydrology of local watersheds. And moving forward into the future, it is very likely that we'll experience significant decreases in snow across Vancouver Island. And what's more interesting is how these decreases are going to be spatially distributed. Obviously, we'll continue to receive snow on Vancouver Island, but it will be mainly confined to the highest elevations of the mountains that run down the central spine of Vancouver Island. We're going to lose a lot of snow in the coastal regions and lower lying elevations. And this could lead to shifts from snow dominated to mixed basins in many areas, as well as shifts from mixed basins to purely rain dominated basins. And this will understandably have important implications for local hydrology in these areas. Furthermore, there could be important implications for the frequency and intensity of rain on snow events in these areas. And rain on snow events are a crucial hydrologic process on Vancouver Island, and they're often associated with destructive flooding, runoff, and landslides, given the simultaneous inputs of rainfall and snow melts. And with these changes to local watersheds, there's also important implications for stream health, fish habitat, water quality, and infrastructural damage as well. So obviously, initiatives such as this climate projection project that we undertook can produce a fairly overwhelming amount of data, figures, and information. So an important part of it was also trying to condense some of this work into more manageable formats. And this is just one example of a snapshot of how parameters that were identified by different operational branches of Mosaic as being important to their work are likely to change relative to a 1981 to 2010 baseline moving forward. And again, this was just to hopefully distill some of that information in a way that is more easily digestible to people working in, for example, this is for the Central Island, working in that area, and they can quickly see how some crucial factors, or sorry, some crucial parameters are likely to change moving forward. This is just one small example of a tool that we can provide our professionals, given the work that we did, to assist in their operational management. And David, who happens to be one of those professionals, could speak to this a little bit more in the duration of the presentation here. So with that, I will hand it over to David.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So as you can see so far, great to have his expertise supporting us on this journey. And so he provided kind of two climate adaptation examples at the opposite ends of our supply chain in the seed orchard and a log handling facility. So there are many climate change implications between those bookends as well. And a result of Ben's work just really reaffirms for us kind of what we've already been doing for decades by managing those multiple objectives of wildlife, drought, invasives, and watersheds. But what is new for us is that we can kind of apply a finer spatial resolution using his work and apply consistent parameters to kind of prioritize on where we have the biggest impact in our adaptation work. And then ultimately for us, it supports a resilient forest for the future foresters to manage on behalf of future pensioners. We're luckier here on the wet coast, but fires, as Ben points out, still a significant risk to the business, and we got to stay laser focused on that in a warming climate. The second picture there, hard to make out, but cedar dieback in dry subzones and that reestablishment of that species is a real challenge today for our foresters and seed orchard, and will be in the future based on Ben's results. We see increased risk of invasives like Scotch broom, and pests are a concern for us here as well. And then, of course, like Ben highlighted, that increase in frequency and intensity of the atmospheric rivers on the coast. What does that mean for our infrastructure as we see these hydrological regimes shift in our watersheds? And the last picture there is from last week. Actually, we still get snow here for now, but what is new in that picture is that harvester thinning, and it's not a novel concept to most parts of Canada, and it's a necessity now for us here to adapt practices in a changing climate. And we think of thinning as that adaptive and mitigative practice because it can increase fire resilience, and there's also some potential advantages from a drought perspective on the east coast of the island, but it's also a mitigative tool in that there really is a good carbon story when you consider capturing that natural mortality into harvested wood products. So that's my transition, Ben, to mitigation, which has been the next slide, a journey of us for quite a while now, and highlight, we know forests play a key role in that fight against climate change, and across our land base, there's home to more than 650 million trees growing, capturing carbon at different rates. And we've certified our greenhouse gas footprint for that entire value chain from seed to customer, including the harvested wood products kind of highlighted in that diagram at the bottom. So Mosaic established a baseline in 2020 with the Carbon Trust of the UK, and that included our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We're close to getting down to that individual tree level with our high intensity LiDAR and drones. And from a carbon perspective, we've had 25 years of research with multiple carbon flux towers. That's a picture of one of them in our forest, and many carbon chronosequence plots as well that are really helping us get closer to measuring carbon and improving the models that we use behind them. And, important to baseline is now a requirement under the SFI objectives for scope 1 and 2 at least. And we've set that science-based target of being a carbon positive company by 2035 and started electrification and reduction journeys. It's really is a journey, and you can read more about that in our sustainability reports. The last I want to highlight is just that graph on the side there, and highlight, carbon flux is going to vary depending, as we all know, species, site index, age. Mosaic, it can take as little as 5 years in a productive site for that forest to switch over from a source to a sink after disturbance, and then it's going to vary as it ages. And Mosaic, we're in second and third rotations for most of our forests, but there is a smaller portion in primary forests. And so from a net zero perspective, reducing our harvest in those primary forests and more intensively manage our second growth really helps us on our net zero pathway. So that's a tie into the next slide, Ben. The final slide here today, just on the Big Coast Forest Climate Initiative. Our organization made the exciting decision to reduce our harvest to develop these carbon credits under a voluntary protocol called the Verified Carbon Standard, Improved Forest Management, VM12. That's the technical jargon. Really, the end result is 40,000 hectares of private land on Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii, including high elevation primary forests and drinking watersheds and other socially sensitive areas. And so those reductions in harvests are going to lead to over 20 million tons of CO2 in emission reductions over the lifetime. A couple of key aspects. It's a group project. It's a mechanism in the standard that allows other landowners in the area to potentially join in without having to validate a project. Another important aspect for us is the extension partners who are going to benefit from sales of credits to support marine climate research in the Pacific Salmon Foundation's case. And new relationship for us is the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, the IPCA. They're going to establish a West Coast Innovation Center and research these specific areas to support more traditional-led research and potentially prioritization for more Indigenous-led conservation in 2050 or beyond. And so this voluntary standard really also allows additional certifications. So we went through another third-party audit on our adherence to these 5 sustainable development goals listed. And so in that case, we link our SFI certification objectives through to many of these SDG goals and show that active forest management really supports the resilience and permanence of these carbon areas as well. And we want to celebrate the co-benefits in this project. Final point, really, carbon credit initiatives like this can be a tool for forest professionals. They demonstrate how our role has meaningful impacts on climate, especially in this decisive decade or two as society starts to transition. And on the flip side, we also need to meet society's need for wood products and biofuels, and there really is no better alternative, as we know, for the environment. So for us, it's really about adaptive management in a changing climate for our professionals as we move forward. And just visit bigcoastforest.com if you want to know more about this project. And I think that's where we wanted to end, with some good examples of adaptation and mitigation in action at Mosaic. And hope we hit the mark, and look forward to a bit of a discussion now. So thanks on behalf of Mosaic.
That was great. Thank you guys for that presentation. Yeah, and it's great to see the partnership between academia research and real world applications. So it's always good to see that happening in real time. So yeah, now we have about 15 minutes left for questions. So again, for participants, if you'd like to use the chat box or Q&A box, please feel free to go ahead and type out your questions there. You can also raise your hand and we'll unmute you if you prefer to ask some questions verbally. Yeah, so we already have a few questions actually that came in through the registration, so I guess we'll start with those and then move along to the chat, and whoever else wants to ask questions can also feel free to raise their hands. So the first question that came through registration was, has optimization modeling been incorporated into your long-term plans for adapting to climate change?
Yeah, and I'll start, I think, with that one. We're definitely looking at it. That would be a natural next step is all these software companies, how do you start to optimize this? Ben and I have reviewed some other third-party platforms that are out there and attempt to look at least putting financial impacts to that, but not necessarily going the next step to modeling impacts. And so we're doing that definitely on the mitigation side when you think we're modeling our net zero pathways. So if we expand our thinning program, what does that do as we model forward and how do we optimize that balance? But on the adaptation side, I think that's probably a next opportunity for these climate models to really think about how you optimize and integrate with our existing kind of software platforms.
Okay, that was great. Kind of going hand in hand with that question is another question that is, now that you have these results from Ben, what is next in terms of engagement or implementation of the results into the business?
And I can start, just from the engineering perspective, for us now to have this consistent level set and Mosaic providing direction in some way to professionals that work on our individual site crossings, for example, and all our professional engineers are incorporating these models on their own or maybe going to different sources. And here we've been able to put together a package that hopefully, saves them time and us money on their individual climate change calculations at a site. But yeah, so for me, that's some of now we can package this up from Ben and start to roll it out to the key professionals that are already having to do this in their practice. And Molly probably has some more around communities and such.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, certainly. I mentioned that bringing our kind of climate story out into the contractor world is a big focus for me and for our climate solutions team now. As we look at our footprint work, we need to make progress with the folks who are running heavy equipment in the field if we're going to make progress on our organizational footprint. And so we need to level set with those folks who have been, in many cases working in the woods for many decades. And, we want to bring them along with us to help them understand why upgrading machinery, right-sizing machinery, changing their practices in terms of, climate-friendly forestry practices is beneficial for them as well as us. So there's a lot of work to do. It's a culture piece, like how we think about bringing safety culture to our contractors, bringing an environmental performance culture to our contractors. We're thinking now about what that climate focus culture looks like in our contractor community as well.
Thanks. Another question has come in through the Q&A from Kate Lindsay, and she says, super presentation. Did you adapt the CCFM guidance yourself, or is there guidance on vulnerability assessments through the SFI standard based on region?
Thanks, Kate, and good to see you here. Yes, so the adaptation of the CCM guidance that we did was in collaboration with our auditing folks. So not our external auditors that report into SFI, but our kind of internal focused auditors who really helped us on this path to meeting the objective, bringing in results from all over the country and outside of our jurisdictions. So that was that was how we thought about taking that guidance and adapting it, particularly for our region and for SFI was with the help of some external auditing folks. We didn't make significant changes, but really tried to focus it in on the local scale and local needs, and felt strongly that we still met the guidance that SFI had released regarding meeting that objective.
Great. Another question from the chat from Mike Brianese. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing the name not correctly, but he says, thanks for the presentation. Given precipitation trends can be quite sensitive to downscaling method, parameters such assumptions, etc., did you consider uncertainty? And did you forecast a range of possible futures or simplify it to a single projection?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. Unfortunately, in this first iteration of the modeling, it was almost sort of a proof of concept for us just to see, A, what we could do, B, would Mosaic in general be really receptive to it? Would they find it useful? And it's been a very, it's been a great experience seeing that the company really has taken to it. So unfortunately, we didn't do as much uncertainty forecasting as I would have liked, but that's fine. And I think anytime that we're looking to build on this modeling moving forward, we'll absolutely incorporate not only more models. We just used the CAN ESM2 model for this one, so just that single model, but you're totally right. Incorporating more than one model is crucial for uncertainty. And especially there's tools online like the PKIC Climate Explorer. They let you do 12 at once, but CAN ESM2 was identified as the best for coastal BC. And we only looked at one greenhouse gas scenario. We used the mid-range because there were some publications at the time that suggested that was a good one to use. But again, if we build on this modeling, we absolutely will look at more models, and we'll also hopefully incorporate more greenhouse gas scenarios just to get a more comprehensive look at the ranges and on the uncertainties surrounding that precipitation estimate. So hopefully in the future, we'll incorporate that more.
We will, for sure. I mean, that's kind of a next logical step for us, is to start to run these extremes and play with the model. It's now kind of there for Ben to build off of now that we've kind of done this first pass.
Okay, great. A kind of follow-up question to that is why RCP 4.5 and PKIC Explorer as the tool for downscaling?
I'll let you go, Ben, with the details on that one.
Absolutely. Obviously, RCP 8.5 has consistently been described as the business as usual scenario in scientific and popular literature, for sure. Several publications have now argued that the emissions projections under RCP 8.5 may appear unlikely, given assumptions you make at societal changes over the next several decades. But again, there was just a couple papers published by PKIC as well as Housefather in and around the time that we were doing that modeling that suggested, with respect to cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, the combination of current policies as well as stated policy intentions, that the expected cumulative emissions perhaps are more aligned with the RCP 4.5 or the RCP 6. So we went with those middle of the road projections for ours. And as far as why use PKIC, they, in my opinion, are one of the best groups out there. And for those who don't know what PKIC is, that's the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. They're right here at the University of Victoria, which is nice. So it's easy to sort of collaborate with them directly. They do a ton of modeling for IPCC reports. They specialize in coastal BC and Northern Canada, which are two particularly complicated areas to do this work for. And they happen to be really good at it. So we just felt comfortable going with PKIC and using PKIC tools.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Another question, and I think you might have already mentioned it, but I'll just ask it anyway. It's from Amy Witherspoon, and she says, great presentation, everyone. What climate modeling software do you use? Also, for coastal BC, what would you say are the top 1 to 3 most important climate variables for informing forest management practices?
How much time do we have? It's a great question.
5 minutes.
The software that we used was all through the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. So using their downscaled data via the Climate Explorer and other sort of open source tools that they have there. From my money, when we're talking about probably some of the most crucial parameters, it really depends. And again, I would definitely refer to David and Molly here. Going to the seed orchard really made me think about some weather and climate things in a different way. I never really considered relative humidity to be overly significant. Whereas if you're working at the seed orchard, you're sort of obsessed with that parameter, because if it's too low, they run into big problems with cones being aborted and other things. For me, most of my work at the start was looking at landslides on Vancouver Island. So again, a big parameter for when we need to shut down is related to the 24-hour accumulated precipitation. And we have certain thresholds that if they're exceeded, obviously work needs to get shut down. So if you're in the wet season, that's key. But again, if you're in the dry season here in Vancouver Island, we're interested in those 4 things that inform fire weather index. So geez, off the top of my head, temperature, relative humidity, wind, and I want to say precip. David, is that?
Yeah,
fourth
and
one?
some of them, like wind, we couldn't model very well into the climate projections, right? So it's for us, what we did is kind of looked at all that we could model in the PKIC. There's probably 60 different parameters, right, Ben, that we started with, and we whittled it down, and then we went to some of the different cross-functional groups and said what's important in your business when with respect to climate change, and then tried to correlate back to a parameter. So I can't remember our top 3, but there were kind of 10 or so that really fell out as important to us. Yeah.
Great question though, Amy. Hope all is well.
Great question.
Yes, thanks. That was a good question. Another question in the Q&A was from Dale Kirklees, and he says, more details, please, on how you are sequestering CO2.
Growing more trees. I mean, that's the big thing for us. How do we reduce our emissions? And that's one side. But as far as sequestering, it's looking at those flux rates and looking at where we can grow more trees. Can we increase our density of stalking moving forward now that we're thinning? Can we look at some places that haven't been planted, or old sites that are now non-productive land, that we can do some carbon soils and in soils and sequestering trees? So there's a number of initiatives that we can do in our business, and I do think carbon financing and that helps drive more sequestration as we move forward, and more tools for us.
Okay. Another question from Amy Witherspoon. She asks, I know thinning practices for drought mitigation are more rare on the West Coast compared to the East Coast, i.e. Quebec. I know some other forestry companies are having difficulties in terms of the cost of machinery and training. How are you tackling that?
Yeah, I'll start, Molly, quickly. Yeah, we have a number of labor initiatives to try and help get people in the seat. We're also doing a number of technology things around just making it easy for a processor operator to sit in the seat, because it's quite a complicated and technical job. And when it comes to thinning, yeah, we don't have we have to right now potentially hire out from out east to bring these folks across, and then start to do some cross training in that. But it is a good question, and a challenge that I think all of industry can work together a bit, government and industry.
And I'll just add that one of the key steps in our thinning program was a close partnership with a contractor who was willing to take this step with us. And so we're asking for them to add to their fleet of machinery something that they haven't experienced before, and it's a big upfront cost. And how we worked with them on that is by guaranteeing that we would keep that machinery working on our land base for a set amount of time for a number of years. So they are guaranteed to make that money back through working on our land base 100% of the time. And then, that was a planning exercise for us. Do we have the appropriate stands for thinning for the next number of years? And we did. There was a big wait for that equipment to come to us, supply chain issues that everyone's experienced. but that equipment arrived last year, and now those two machines are working full time, as David said, with folks from the East Coast in the seat. So thanks for anyone from the Maritimes for training our operators on good thinning practices.
We're out of time, but there's one final question if we can just squeeze it in. It's from Mike, who asks, how heavy and how frequent of thinning are you implementing for adaptation? Relative balance of optimizing silviculture result versus optimizing adaptation needs.
Well, very good question. I think this is part of our as we move forward is starting to set up the research trials in behind our thinning and looking at some of those different entries as far as percentage of removals and, you know, hitting it with a fertilizer and reviewing the carbon impacts. And so there's a number of things we're looking to study, including water and fire impacts. So there's a bunch of research, and if anybody has some for us and wants to share anything, please send it our way. We're learning on this journey.
Okay, I think those are the questions. Thank you again very much for participating and presenting, and thank you for the audience for joining us today. And with that, we'll follow up with the recording and the presentation slides as well. And yeah, hope you have a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah.